Good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Rogers. I'm the Executive Director for the Kelowna Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to another edition of Business Smarts in the age of COVID. It's a pleasure to have you with us today as we focus on working remotely. And want to welcome everyone that has joined us. Just a reminder, this is being done through Zoom. We assume at this stage you likely have had some experience, but just so you know, we are recording this session. So if you want to go back to this, we'll send out some links and information afterwards so you can review aspects of it. There is a Q&A function menu at the bottom of your screen. Please ensure that you take advantage of that at any time. If you have a question that you want to raise, we will certainly have some questions and answers for both Heather and Ian, who have been gracious to join us this morning. And you can also use the chat function if you want to make a comment along the way. This is about working remotely. As I've had some discussion with some of our members, shifting the way we do business is not a bad thing unless you understand what that really means and you do it consciously and thoughtfully. We've got two great guest speakers this morning that are going to help us in that regard so that we don't stumble our way into some challenges and we think long-term and ensure that we have productive work environments that are thoughtful for the work that we do, but also create good work environments that are healthy places for people to be employed. Heather and Ian have been working remotely since the early 2000s. In the past decade, they've managed working together across two continents and completed projects in Canada and the US as well as the UK, where Ian has joined us. I'll more formally introduce them in just a moment. We at the Kelowna Chamber want to thank all our members that continue to stand by us. We can't do the work we do in advocating on your behalf without our members. We receive no government funding, except I should note we are fortunate to be able to access the federal government's wage subsidy program to continue to provide programs like this for you, and we continue to provide them at no cost to members and non-members in the business and in the community. We can't do it though without our foundational partners. We'd like to acknowledge Interior Savings, BDO, UBC Okanagan, and MNP Accounting, Consulting, and Tax, our Pillar President Circle members. Just before getting back and introducing our guest speakers, do want to flag our membership meeting. The AGM online version will be coming up on Thursday, July 9th. If you're a member of the Kelowna Chamber, would love to have you as part of that. You should have already received communication and official notification. If you haven't, just give us a call here at the Chamber office. We'll give you the links so you can join us for the AGM and the recap of 2019. You can also contact communications@kelownachamber.org to get more information about the business that we will conduct, including reviewing our 2019 financial statements. Also, we are planning our golf tournaments shifted from the spring to September. It's a day of golf at the Harvest Golf Club. It should be a great day out at the Harvest. If you want to register for that or find information, just check out our website under events. And we do want to acknowledge and thank Park Pacific Projects, who have stuck with us as our title sponsor for a golf tournament as we figured out a new way to hold that event, but we're looking forward to it. And our Business Excellence Awards, so we likely will not have the major gala that we normally host. We'll a bit of a hybrid, probably in November, a bit of an online and some in person, given where we are with phase 3 of the BC's Restart program. The nominations, though, will be coming out shortly, so keep your eye out for that. You'd like to take some time out from the challenges that you're facing now to recognize those that have made a great contribution over 2019 in the world of business and community development. So to get on to our subject today, working remotely, we are pleased to have Heather Stewart and Ian MacRae with us. I want to give you a bit more background. Heather Stewart is the principal with Sage Transitions and has been working remotely for nearly 17 years. She's the founder of Sage Transitions and has been a leader and entrepreneur for her entire career, both in senior leadership positions and in her own business. She supports organizations in identifying, recruiting, and selecting high potential talent. She's worked with not-for-profits, for-profit agencies, and post-secondary institutions to support their development needs. Heather facilitates complex strategic plans, develops business cases, and supports systems, processes, and organizational change. And we are in one mammoth of a change management situation. Heather has a master's degree in distance education and many certifications to use a wide variety of personality and emotional intelligence assessments. And Ian MacRae, workplace psychologist with Sage Transitions, has been working remotely for 15 years. Ian has consulted on leadership assessment and development for more than a decade. Based in London in the UK, he developed the High Potential Trait Indicator with Adrian Fernhan, which is an assessment of personality and leadership potential. The High Potential Trait Indicator has been translated into dozens of languages and has been used by tens of thousands of people from over 50 countries around the world. His latest book, Myths of Social Media, was published in April 2020 and will guide the discussions of the use of social media with remote workers. I'm going to bring them both into the camera. It was interesting, I mentioned at the start, thanks Heather and Ian for joining us. When I started to read your bio, Ian, I'm an accomplished author, master's degree, and involved in all sorts of things. I expected some long beard, you know. So congratulations on your accomplishments. Heather, you're no stranger. You've been involved in Kelowna and the Chamber for a little bit here. So I want to thank both of you for joining us. I know we've got a number of attendees, so looking forward to your presentation. We are recording today just so that folks know, and we'll make this available. Use the Q&A button. You don't have to wait till the end if you have questions along the way. We're also going to have some polls. So I'll turn things over to you two. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, so today we want to talk about kind of personality traits, potential, and especially in leading remote workers. Because I think one of the challenges a lot of people have had is in the immediate and sudden transition from either people not being able to work in the regular way, not being able to work in their regular location, or just a lot of major sudden changes that we've had to adapt to. So I've actually been working on a research project for more than a year now. Initially started with Roberta Sawatsky from Okanagan College, who is a big advocate of remote work. So we thought about a year ago, it'd be interesting to see what are the personality traits, what are the indicators of success and potential in remote work. And I think the timing has been very good to finish that research off last year and be able to talk about it today in a condition where so many people now have had to manage and figure out how to manage remote workers effectively. So Heather and I are going to talk about that and talk about some of our expertise from kind of clients and experience and our own experience and history working remotely. So we're going to give away, we've got two book draws, High Potential and Myths of Social Media, which are kind of the combination of what we're going to talk about today. So High Potential is about how to spot, manage, and develop talented people at work. So it's basically the key factors, the psychological factors that predict success and potential at work. Personality is a big part of that, which is what we're going to talk about. And Myths of Social Media is, we found just a better title for what is essentially a digital communications book, but talking about it in the context of social media and all of the different ways communication, especially business communication, has been moving online over the last, well, more than a decade now, but really especially intensified over the last few years. So I think that's something that is really interesting in the context of remote work, is how to manage that communication when you can't necessarily do face-to-face communication. So we'll talk about workplace personality, high potential and leadership, and especially the personality of remote workers. So what contributes to success in remote working? And then finally, we're going to talk about some kind of specific examples or case studies of working remotely or kind of personality in different types of workplaces. So we're going to start out with a quick poll, and we've got 3 in total. So we'll put that up and we're going to talk a bit about the results just to see kind of your experience of remote working and get some feedback and see where you guys are in relation to some of the topics. So if we can put poll number 1 up, there we go. So what proportion of your time do you spend working remotely? And we're talking about right now. So we're interested in just seeing, is anyone back at work? Are you spending a greater or less proportion of your time working remotely?
All right, most people are entering. We'll give you another 5 seconds or so. A couple more coming in.
Okay.
People doing the math.
Yep.
Is that 150% of my work time? Excellent. I'm going to 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And share the results.
Okay, so that's interesting to see. So most people, almost everyone is working a majority of the time remotely. A lot of people getting close to 100%. So it's funny because if we did that poll about a year ago, it probably would have been reversed, where most people were 0 or 1 to 25%. So it's interesting to see that. So good example of the rise of remote working. In the research, we're going to be talking about some research results from last year, actually, in the study of remote workers and personality traits. And the range of people who were working remotely last summer was their proportions were anywhere from about 2% to 100%. So it's good to see that difference in that range of how much people are working remotely, because there's all sorts of blended options or different ways or combinations of working remotely in the office. I think over the next probably 6 months to a year, we're going to see a lot of conversations about what's the ideal percent, how much do people want to be in a workplace versus working remotely, and how do you manage communications between people who have very different schedules and workplace locations. It was funny to write about this about a year ago, talking about the rise of remote work, when we're seeing maybe 10, 15, 20% of people working remotely, and predictions, for that to rise by a few percent or by 2020. But now we're seeing the majority of people are working remotely. So hopefully this research is going to be even more useful now, just in the context of it being such a big part of most people's work lives. But my prediction would be we're probably not going to return to the situation where everyone is in the office most of the time. We'll see how different companies take that balance and approach that, but I think this isn't a trend that is going to go away anytime soon. So I'm going to talk a bit about the personality traits in detail in a couple slides later, but we did find 3 personality traits that were really specifically related to improve performance in remote work. So those were conscientiousness, which is about kind of managing, planning, and organizing and motivating yourself. So people with higher conscientiousness, more effective in remote work, which fully makes sense, right? So people who are good at managing themselves and their schedule and motivating themselves are better when they have to work independently. A bit later, I'm going to talk about how to manage people on different ends of that spectrum. But you can see people with higher conscientiousness tend to adapt a bit better in that situation. Adjustment, which is about stress levels. So people who have greater capacity to manage and deal with stress also tend to be more likely to work remotely, tend to be a bit more effective in remote work. And then the last one was curiosity. So this is a personality trait that's specifically about finding new information and new approaches. So people who enjoy adapting and learning new things were more effective in remote work, which again makes sense, especially if you're in a context where people need to be learning very quickly new technology, new tools, new communication methods. So I'll talk about those in more detail. But especially when we talk about personality and potential and remote work, we need to make sure we're talking about potential to do what, because that's one of the issues I've seen a lot in any discussion about high potentials, or whether you're talking about leadership or whatever type of high potential, is you're not always, some people aren't specifying potential to do what. So is it potential to succeed in a leadership role or in a technical capacity or in a very specific environment, which is maybe working from home? So that's why we want to make sure we're talking about a very specific type of potential. So in this case, we're talking about potential to succeed when you're working independently on your own remotely instead of in a physical office space. And talk about clearly defined outcomes and performance management, because that's so important for remote workers. And we'll talk a bit about more of that later on, is having really clearly defined objectives, outcomes, deliverables, however you're managing it. So people who are working remotely know what they should be doing, how they should be doing it, because that's such an important part of communication. And it's a big part of that potential for success in a remote working environment. One of the reasons personality is important, there's a few key reasons. I've written a lot on this, so if you want to read more about the HBTI or personality, if you just Google my name and personality or high potential, a whole bunch of articles will come up. But the reason personality is important is we can measure it, and it's very stable over people's adult lifespan. So it's really good for predicting potential in the future, because we know personality is a kind of consistent, stable pattern of how people think, act, and behave. So if we can predict that in the sense of, conscientiousness or adjustment or managing stress, we know what kind of situations and capacities and roles people are likely to be successful in the future. We also know that it's really highly linked to workplace outcomes. So we can use these personality traits, especially in the HBTI, to predict very specific kind of success criteria and where people are likely to succeed in. It's a foundational dimension of potential, so it's pretty universally applicable, and it's also a really good indicator of leadership potential. We'll talk a bit about leadership, but again, if you're interested in more of that, if you just Google my name and leadership, a lot of this will come up. So we're going to talk about these 6 personality traits, which are the HBTI personality traits, and these are specifically designed to measure personality in the workplace and related to success criteria. So I'll go into the details about those and specifically how they're related to remote work. So the 6 traits are, I've mentioned the first 3 that are most important for remote work: conscientiousness, adjustment, curiosity. And this image you see here on screen is how the reports come up. So if you've got a leadership report, this is kind of how their traits are mapped onto optimal leadership zones. And then the next 3 traits are risk approach, ambiguity, acceptance, competitiveness. And I'm going to talk about exactly what they are. But first, I would like to do one more poll. So we'll have the second poll here up for you in a sec, to get your sense of...
Pull it up, and there we go.
Oh, great. So before I go into more detail about the personality traits, I want to see which of these 6 things you think are most important for remote work. I've kind of given you a hint, but I'm also interested in your perspective. So if you have an explanation or a reason why, feel free to put this in the comment box or the Q&A, and we can talk a bit about that later. But right now, maybe just choose which of these you think is most important for remote work. There's no right answer necessarily, but there are some very clear indicators of which are best predictors of success.
We're getting some thoughtful reflection. Just a few more. Good. Give some folks some time. 75% have voted.
Right.
Oh, looks like some changes.
Oh.
People are adjusting. And we'll give you another 10 seconds here. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Interested to see what they are now.
And there you go.
Okay, interesting. So we've got a good range. So a lot of people have said, well, conscientiousness, which is one of the first ones. We tend to find that's a pretty big predictor of success. Managing stress adjustment, someone said that. Change, we've got a really good distribution. So clearly all of them are important in different ways. I'm really interested to hear your explanations or your rationales for those. So show your work in the Q&A box, and we'll go back to that later.
Well, just a couple of comments maybe about looking at ambiguity, acceptance, and collaboration. Because I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about the leadership sort of lens in all of this. So thank you for all of your feedback.
So we're going to go on to, this is some of the results from the research showing personality traits of remote workers. So 50 is the benchmark of the average population score for HBTI traits. And we can see what the average remote worker is in comparison. So I mentioned this briefly before, conscientiousness, sorry, the labels aren't there, but the first 3 are conscientiousness, adjustment, and then curiosity. So those are all quite a bit higher. Whereas the next one, ambiguity, acceptance, was about the same, slightly higher, but not a statistical difference between remote workers and the general population. We saw risk approach tended to be a lot higher, but it was also, by remote workers, it was not rated as one of the most important for their work. So there's a bit of complexity in that I think was partly related to the specific occupations of the people we were asking about. And we found competitiveness was a lot lower in remote workers, which is also really interesting because it tends to be an environment where you're getting less regular recognition and praise and visibility if you're not in an office workplace. So we found people who preferred to work at home or work remotely and chose to do that often had lower levels of competitiveness. So just interesting in that perspective. I mean, consistently we were finding conscientiousness, adjustment, and curiosity. as the kind of most important ones. And the reason those are important, I want to talk about the low and the high end of the spectrum of each of these traits. But people with lower conscientiousness tend to need more external motivation. So they need, whether it's a manager or people around them or schedules or some sort of structure that helps them manage their work, their performance. Whereas people with higher conscientiousness tend to be much better at motivating themselves, but may be prone to workaholism. So it's interesting to see with home workers, remote workers, we see people with higher conscientiousness have trouble switching off. So those are the people who are really driven, really focused, but then sometimes have trouble finishing work when they should or when they think they should. Whereas people with lower conscientiousness tend to need more kind of check-ins, more support, and more external motivation from a manager or a leader who's kind of monitoring and encouraging their remote work. So if we're looking at potential to be successful in remote work, higher conscientiousness tends to be a bit of a better indicator. But it's also really important to know how to manage people with different levels of traits, because that's not saying someone with low conscientiousness could not be successful in remote working. It's just that they need different types of supports to be effective. Then the next one is adjustment and remote work. So people with lower adjustment tend to be more prone to stress and frustration, but they also tend to be more perceptive to stress and about the stress of things that are going on around them. Whereas we see people with higher adjustment tend to be a bit more resilient to stress, less insecure, less worry. The drawback to that is sometimes they can be seen as a bit more aloof or less worried, a bit cold. But we see in any stressful situation, people with higher adjustment levels tend to just be more effective at managing that stress. And that's related to your brain and your neurochemistry, is it's the wiring of the pathways for the stress that you experience is pretty hardwired in there. And different people have different levels of kind of thresholds to stress. So it's good to know those levels and who can manage certain levels of stress and who's going to need a bit more emotional support or kind of support from their manager or from colleagues, and what level of stress that people can deal with. Of course, everyone has a level and everyone has stuff that push them over too, but some people just kind of have a much higher level of that dam as their kind of baseline. So this is really, really good to know in managing any workforce, but especially remote workers, when you know people might not necessarily ask for help, or they might not necessarily know who to turn to for support in a really difficult, challenging time. So if you know that some people are more vulnerable to stress, you know who and when might need support. But generally, when we see predicting success of remote workers, higher adjustment tends to be an asset. Curiosity, again, is really important for remote work because it's about higher curiosity, embracing new ideas, exploring different techniques, ways of doing your work. So we see people with higher curiosity tend to learn a bit faster. That's not to say people with lower curiosity aren't going to learn, but just that they might be a bit more resistant to change. So sometimes people with lower curiosity are really good in roles where you want someone who's dependable, focused, and reliable, but maybe not the biggest innovator. So you can see how that would fit differently in different types of roles. But if you're in an environment like remote work or being new to remote work, sometimes curiosity is a bit of an asset. The next one is risk approach. So this is essentially a proactive versus reactive approach to managing risk or challenge difficult conversations. So higher risk approach tends to be more proactive, but sometimes in the excessive or the ultra high range of risk approach, it can be a bit too aggressive or bullying. So you have to pay attention to that. Whereas people with lower risk approach tend to be more conflict averse, may have more difficulty approaching and resolving problems, and be a bit more reactive. So sometimes we see that, especially in combination with people lower adjustment, tend to be a bit more reactive in response to risk. That one was one of the ones that was higher in our population, but we're a bit cautious about saying whether or not it's more important to remote work. Ambiguity acceptance. This is an interesting one because this was the most endorsed in our poll. So more people said ambiguity acceptance would be important to remote work, which is really interesting because if we're looking at higher ambiguity acceptance, that's embracing unstructured or unclear environments, seeking a range of information, seeing a range of complex information from a range of sources, which again, you can see how it would be really useful, especially in an ambiguous or challenging time, like right now, where there's not necessarily any clear answers or any certainty about what the future is going to look like in 6 months. Whereas lower ambiguity acceptance, people tend to look for needing more clarity and direction at work. This is really important for managing remote workers because people with lower ambiguity acceptance need really clear and really specific guidelines, success criteria. They need maybe a list of tasks to do, but they need a lot of focus and direction and clarity. Whereas people with higher ambiguity acceptance really thrive when they have more control and autonomy over their own work. So with managing people with these levels of traits, really useful to know that. Finally, competitiveness. This, again, was one that was lower in our remote working population. So we saw people who were remote workers tended to have less need for kind of recognition for the spotlight, and less driven by competition, which really makes sense for people who are working remotely and are probably more competing with their own performance than with people around them in the office. But again, this is a really useful one to know for managing remote workers, because people with high competitiveness have more of a need for kind of praise and recognition and like that kind of public recognition, whereas people with lower competitiveness might find that a bit embarrassing, or might like more kind of personal or subtle kind of recognition or praise for their work. So I'm going to skip this slide, actually, and we'll just talk about high potential and leadership and the capacity of those traits. And I'm going to pass it over to Heather.
Hi all, I've been trying to answer some of the Q&A and respond to comments. So nice to be able to talk with you, although it's really to you, isn't it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about high potential and leadership from the leader's perspective and what we as leaders need to consider. So let's, Ian, you want to go to the next slide? Got a Vanna thing going here, you know, with the slide thing. So maybe some bright glimpses of the obvious. I know who, I know some of the people that are on the call and could probably be teaching this. So hi to all of you. And what I call BGOs. So what we know, and maybe just a useful reminder, that as Ian says, as leaders, we've ended up in this situation where it's constant change and need to adapt. And when you think about that in terms of personality traits, that's curiosity, and it may be, as Carrie just suggested, ambiguity, acceptance as well. So you need to really look at your own leadership traits and styles. Some of folks on this call have done the high potential trait indicator. You know where your results are, but how do you lead? Where are you pushed in these times? Are you pushed? Are you comfortable with adaptation, or are you maybe a little lower on curiosity? And you know, when you consider sort of the situational leadership, that different workers require different leadership styles. I know we all know this, but do you find yourself using the same kind of processes and systems with everyone? And if so, how can you change those, and how can you get more information about your workers? Ian's just talked about this, so that you're really thinking, okay, that person doesn't want a lot of recognition on our Zoom calls or on team calls, or that person needs more support. They like clearer systems and procedures. I don't want to say they're black and white, but they might be a little bit that way. And some people need lots of communication, lots of feedback, and some, to be perfectly honest, don't need to hear it as much. And we're going to talk about each of these. Next slide, Vanna. So, you know, those of you who know me know that I occasionally have a sense of humor. So I found this and thought, oh, that's kind of funny. So if you know, when was the last time you've looked at your own, whether it's a resume, a list of your skills, a list of your priorities, a list of how you manage and your leadership skills, when have you thought about what COVID and the remote work and all the chaos has done to you, for you, with you? And how has that changed how you lead? Because we do need to change as we work with remote workers. And Ian and I have talked about this a lot. You know, what do you need to do differently on a Zoom call? What do you need to do differently when you can't sit down over coffee, my favorite, and talk to someone face to face? So let's look at the details. I didn't want to Vanna you again, sorry. So what self-care are you doing? You know, the whole self-care and awareness piece, I spent much of my leadership life not thinking about that at all. So, you know, we thought about work and we separated work and personal life. And how do we do that now when you're in your basement, when you're in an office, in your home? How do you separate that need to really be clear and to think about yourself and understand as a leader what your own stress and how you manage it? So think about, you know, what stresses you at work? How is that stress combined with working at home and the fact that you have kids home from school, that your partner may be working in another office on a Zoom call and you're both using headphones. And there's some stresses that come not only with leading remote workers, but managing from home for you as well. And I think we all need to ask for help and support when we need it. And I don't have a lot of conversations with others, and I realize I probably should have more. I do have some colleagues and friends and Ian who we talk about, but not only do you need to think about that for yourself, but do you have those questions that you ask about remote workers? Do you ask them how they're doing? Kylene this morning, because she's magical at doing this, sent me an email saying, "Oh, I'm really looking forward to the webinar, and I'm sure it'll be fantastic," or something like that. Because Kylene's one of those people who is really good at doing that. Sorry to embarrass you, Kylene, but I hope you're okay. So when you think about all of these, this is a adjustment about managing your own stress and anxiety so you can manage that in the people with whom you work.
And I think it's interesting too, because the last 3 or 4 months with the lockdown has really caused a lot of people to have to reflect on what coping strategies they use to manage anxiety. Because, you know, when there's a lockdown and they say, you know, you can't visit your friends, don't go outside, don't exercise as much, all of the things that a lot of people would use as their natural coping mechanisms were gone for a while. So people had to really think about what they were using and other ways to manage that stress and anxiety. And I think there might have been that reflection for a lot of people in a way that probably wouldn't have happened in a normal situation.
Thanks, Ian. Next slide. So, you know, when I was looking back over the last 3 months about what stressed, you know, the amount of change. I think I know more about and more of the public health environment in Canada than I have ever known because I watched it daily, sometimes more than once. Just trying to understand what was happening and have some clarity about where we're headed. I'm very conscientious. I like to plan. I like to figure things out. And I don't know how you felt, but that was pretty hard to do. And I know from talking to some of my colleagues in post-secondary, you know, are you going to offer courses fully online? Are you going to have some in-person pieces? Are you going to, what platforms are you going to use? And then so many people were dealing with financial security issues. Were you going to continue to get a paycheck? I work with a large manufacturing company that has plants in across the Western provinces. And when I talk to leaders and workers, which I did frequently throughout this time because we do work around succession planning and leadership development, I heard these things over and over, that in order to support other people, you really needed to understand where you were at, because leaders and supervisors, some of them were working partly remotely. I talked to an environmental engineer, brand new to a job, had a small team. They were working mostly remotely, but the work they do means that they needed a lot of engagement from the folks who were, from the workers who were in the plants working in very difficult and challenging situations. So she said she had to really understand, this environmental engineer had to understand how she was managing her own stress of a new job, a new place to live, and then trying to change some environmental processes, systems, regulatory kinds of things that had significant impact on others in the plant. So how do you do that? How do you understand what they're focusing on and worrying about? And how do you do that when you don't see them? And so, you know, a couple of times she said she had to mask up, go to a crew meeting, go into the plant and have the conversation while fully masked. So, you know, you think about what we've been through, it is the epitome for me of the kind of stress and challenge that most of us have probably never dealt with in our lives in this way. Ian, do you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, and I think it's been interesting too, because some companies have had very different experiences adapting just because of the nature of the work they do or the industry they're in. So, you know, manufacturing, people can't work from home. There's all sorts of sectors people don't have that option. Whereas, you know, I've worked with some of the tech companies in London who, for them, switching their entire workforce to remote work overnight was very minimal because they had a workforce that was relatively experienced with the tech. People already had all the tools and equipment to be able to do that. Some of the smaller companies, I think, found that a lot easier. Whereas it's, you know, it's sometimes there's so much divergence in what different industries have had to do to adapt that sometimes it's hard to know. The other example I heard is there was some HR departments, this was actually in BC, but where it was just one or two people who companies, HR departments or people from different companies were coming together to have kind of strategy meetings or share ideas together between companies that would normally be competitors, because they were so overwhelmed, they didn't know or have anyone else that they could talk to. So it was just interesting to see what kind of innovation was happening for people to manage that level of stress and that level of uncertainty.
Thank you. So just consider yourself as a leader, and Ian's talked a fair bit about the different traits, but if you looked at conscientiousness and curiosity, you know, how are you managing your workload? How are you meeting deadlines and goals? I was really impressed in working with the Chamber and getting this webinar up and running, because we did a practice run, we did some stuff on Zoom. Clearly, it's an organization for whom conscientiousness is important, because I think I can speak for Ian and I were both really comfortable that leadership was evident in putting this together. And so, you know, when you think about your own conscientiousness, I really like Ian's comment about the HR departments getting together and talking about it. I know that some of the nonprofits in BC have been having Zoom calls to talk about the challenges around the province and what they're dealing with it and how they can do that collaboratively. So again, you know, this is a group that's conscientious, that wants to do better, and they're also curious, and they're reaching out to learn, adapt, to ask questions, talk to other people, and really listen to the results, which is what ideally we're doing with the people who are working remotely. So, you know, you're thinking about how you're able to manage workload, how you can adapt, how you're open to ideas, because we know that some of those best ideas come from those around you, but you really need to ask and you need to actively listen, not become so involved in the chaos and uncertainty that you close yourself down to innovation. Ian, anything you want to add to?
All right, yeah, I think that.
All right.
Not yet. Go for it.
We're just going to have a little duet here. I'm going to go on this and then I'll ask Ian the question. That was a perfect example of asking the question and not waiting for the response, just in case anyone noticed that. So different workers, different leadership styles. So if you've got a worker that's highly conscientious and has high curiosity, which we've talked about, these are highly motivated and interested workers. But they need stimulation. They're interested, they like innovation, they like new tasks, and they may challenge you. So that kind of worker needs a leader who is going to let the person do their work, will understand that they perhaps don't need a lot of direction, and that are going to give those folks the opportunity to try things that are more innovative, to take on new tasks, and maybe to challenge the systems and processes that are there and have been there in your organization and need to be adapted for the place we are now. Whereas if you get somebody who's high conscientiousness and low curiosity, again, motivated, but these lower curiosity folks, they like the systems and processes. They don't want to experiment with new information and new techniques. So if you've got a team that has people with a variety of traits, but particularly these two, then how do you lead that group so that both those folks with, and these are only two of the personality traits, with a different approach to innovation, change, and experimentation, if they're on a team together, will you have some differences of opinions? Where will there be some conflict? And how do you as a leader manage that? And Ian, this time I will listen to your response.
Yeah, well, and for those of you who are profs with students, these are the high conscientiousness, low curiosity students are the one who just want to know the answer. They'll get the essay done, but they want to know what the right answer is and they'll figure out how to write it instead of wanting to explore all the other options, coming up with their own kind of take on it. But sometimes just, you know, give me the way to do this and I'll get it done on time. Sometimes those people are great to work with. In some positions, it's more of a challenge.
All right, next slide.
Yep.
So I'll just let you read this one.
This is a funny one because I got in trouble on Twitter a couple of weeks ago because I wrote a few articles about about managing performance and productivity in the context of lockdown. And I was saying that, you know, we're in the UK, we've been 12 weeks into a pretty severe lockdown, and people's patterns are really crystallizing now. So if you've had performance issues for 12 weeks, it's getting to be more and more difficult to do any meaningful behavior change. So now is the time to look at that. And so people got really mad and said, until the crisis is over, we can't do any sort of performance management. It's not fair to people. I don't know what everyone thinks on that point, but I'm not sure if that perspective is necessarily realistic for most businesses.
And Ian, maybe you can look at the Q&A and take me to the next slide and see if we've got any questions on some of what we've been going through.
Sure, and just for the benefit of the group too, we'll get into the Q&A and we'll read them out, and I'll go through them so that we can share all the information. So we'll certainly get there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. So, you know, the happiness quotient. When I started my career, I've been around a little longer than Ian. And so, you know, it was less important, but if you read the results of the study that Ian and Roberta did, and if you look at workplaces, and if you've grown as a leader, which I know we all have, we need to, and we want to consider the well-being, the satisfaction, the happiness of the people with whom we work. And this is so critical now. Because as Ian says, you know, there will be some remote workers who need a lot less validation and appreciation and recognition. There's others who need it a lot, and they need it in writing, they need it in groups, they need it on Zoom calls. So you need to figure this out, and the performance management piece, whether it's that annual performance appraisal that we all dread, or it's the regular kind of situation where you've got a process in place, whatever that process is as a leader, to make sure that you understand how and what employees, workers need, how they want to hear it, and that you remind yourself. And some people are a lot better at providing appreciation and validation than others. So, you know, if you yourself don't need much validation and you don't need to hear it very frequently, but other people do, we need to understand that our behavior has to be adapted to meet the needs of others. And Ian, if you just go to the next slide. So I'm going to be back to active questioning and listening, something that I just demonstrated I did not as well as I might with Ian. That is something that we have to work on, I think, for our whole life, is to really consider how we actively question and listen, but especially in the performance feedback piece. And do you as a leader get feedback from others? Do you ask for feedback from your workers? And do you provide the appreciation and recognition that they require? And then what connections do you use? How do you manage across various platforms? Are you using Zoom? Are you using Slack? What are you using to have your teams work better together and maintain connections and communication? And I'm going to ask Ian just to talk a little bit, if he can, before I go to the last point on this slide, about the myths of social media and the kinds of connections and platforms that people are using with remote workers.
Yeah, well, that's one of the other things that we've talked about, is that because it's a mix, there's a lot of opportunities and a lot of really good tools out there for communication and digital communication especially. But so it's almost sometimes as much of a challenge to get the balance right and not to do too much as to get the right stuff. Because the other issue we've had with remote working, and a lot of people would talk about this, is information overload or communication overload. So it's really important, I think, for leaders in particular to make sure that they know which communication platforms their teams or their groups are using and are using them appropriately. And it's also really important to model behavior, because it's one thing to get a Slack channel going or get a few Slack channels or get people into different teams online. It's another thing to make sure that people understand and know how to use the communication technology effectively. So I always suggest that managers, leaders, HR should be using those platforms and modeling kind of ideal behavior. So saying, this is what we want to talk about. These are kind of the way we speak in the sense of being kind of, you know, proactive or being kind to other people, or really modeling that communication and how different channels are used. And so you might say, okay, here's the Slack channel. here's the work-focused ones, and then we might have a few other recreational ones over here. Or we might not use this platform at all. If you want to have kind of personal conversations, there's another place to do it, but here's the forum to do it. Because I think that's one of the things people really have a challenge with, is understanding what's kind of appropriate in the communication channels online, what's encouraged, and what's expected. And so just modeling that behavior is really important.
And the last point with mental health supports, I've been reading a lot about this, and I'm not a mental health expert. I know there's some HR folks on this call. You know, what are you doing? How are you recognizing it in employees? If you don't feel you have the skills and ability, because this is something that I think we would all be challenged to do. What is your organizational have? Do you have an employee assistance program? Do you have some first aid people with some of these kinds of skills? But let's not forget that so many people are struggling with mental health issues right now. And as workplaces, we can help and support them. We only have, we're very anxious to get to the questions, and there's some great ones and comments. So Ian's got a few more minutes, 3 or 4 more minutes, and then we're going to switch to the Q&A.
Okay, yeah, I've got a few charts that are really specific results from the research that I can go through quickly. But one of the findings we found was that people who worked remotely more were more satisfied with their jobs. So we saw higher kind of increases of engagement, job satisfaction with people who worked remotely more. Now, it's important to say for this research, this is with people who wanted to work remotely. So that is going to have an impact. But we're seeing that remote work does have the capacity to increase people's job satisfaction, reduce turnover, intention, etc., if it's managed well, and if the other kind of tools and supports and everything is behind that. The other result from this is people with high adjustment had higher job satisfaction, which is very consistent for what we see with every piece of research we do. People with higher levels of adjustment tend to report higher job satisfaction levels. This is an interesting one because performance feedback, performance management is highlighted so frequently in the remote work research. And this was unsurprisingly, we saw most people were not satisfied with the performance feedback they were getting from their peers, from their supervisor, from performance reviews. You know, so 35% of people were satisfied with that. Often it was not frequent or not detailed enough. But I think this is one of the things that we were seeing among people who were self-selected, who wanted to work remotely. They weren't happy with the performance feedback. I bet if we looked at this as a cross-section of the population of remote workers now, it would be even lower than that. So it's something to think about is how we manage that performance feedback, because especially in the longer term, as those kind of relationships that initially were developed in the office have to be translated into an online environment, as we're getting new people joining the workforce and stuff, that culture isn't necessarily automatically going to be there. So we really need to look at managing performance and communication in the longer term. And this is an interesting one too about people's preferred feedback methods. So these are people who worked remotely from, you know, a range of like 2 to 100% of the time, but most of them were self-selected remote workers, and most of them worked a majority of the time remotely. Face-to-face performance feedback was still their preferred method. So even if it couldn't be face-to-face in person, video calls were still preferred. But if we're talking important, specific performance feedback information, especially if it's going to affect their, you know, promotions or pay rises or their career, it's really important to have those directly. The other thing that I think is really coming up as people work remotely more is that Zoom and the digital kind of communications technology is really good, but it's still not as good as face-to-face communication. It doesn't perfectly replicate it, and it's not at the same kind of quality or level. There's been a few really good studies recently out that show kind of communication over Zoom doesn't convey the same level of information because you can't see all the micro expressions or everything that I'm doing with my face or all of the nonverbal communication necessarily that you would be able to see about me in person. So there's a few interesting research results from that research just showing that there's a bit of Zoom exhaustion, partly because we're not getting the same information in the same way that we would just naturally pick up from people. And also because people tend to have to be more expressive on Zoom conversations, as you can see, that's why I'm gesturing emphatically. So it is not necessarily a perfect replacement for in-person face-to-face communication. So that's going to be something really important to remember as we get back to kind of blended remote works or whatever the environment is, to know that it's not a perfect replacement. It's a great substitution if we use it in the right way, but it's not necessarily a full replacement. The other thing is when we're talking about performance feedback from a supervisor or from a manager, having more formal communication methods were really, really important. So people wanted clear follow-up, they wanted written information, and this is just really about clarity and why that's so important for remote work. I'm gonna move on from this because I could spend another 20 minutes talking about it, but I don't want to because we don't have time. So the key messages are remote and flexible working is here to stay. I don't know if anyone disagrees with me, please feel free, but I think it's unlikely to be different. Personality is really linked to success in a remote working environment, as it is in any environment, but you need to know specifically what success criteria are. And performance management and feedback is so important to remote workers. And in the longer term, it's going to be really important as we look at maintaining kind of levels of performance and engagement in the workplace. So we've got links here. Are we going to do the book draw now?
We can do that near the end. We'll do some Q&As if you'd like.
Yeah, we've got our contact information here.
So just to remind those that have joined us and some have come and gone, we'll make all those that registered, we'll send them an email with all the information, the slide deck and the contact information, but you can take it there as well.
Okay.
But if you're ready, we've got a few stacked up. We've got a few questions that were provided in advance and a few that are in the loop. We do respect everybody's time, so we'll try to wrap up near the bottom of the hour. But if you continue to ask questions or want to leave us a chat, we'll try to get to as many. If we can't get to them, we'll follow up afterwards as well. So I'm going to jump into the question and appreciate, Heather, you had answered the one, I think from Carrie. Managing complexity seems to be really important from the experiences that I've had, and I'm witnessing in my colleagues, of course, managing schedules. At this point in time, remote working is really new to many people, so they have no norm. As people become more accustomed to working remotely, the importance might shift. Did you want to comment further on that, Heather, for the benefit of all those that have gathered?
Yeah, I just think, as Ian has said, this does look like this is something that we're not moving back into workplaces I don't think, as Ian says. And so you're looking at people's levels of curiosity, you're looking at ambiguity, acceptance, you're looking at just understanding what that new norm is and really having the time to have those conversations and to ask. Because lots of people just moved into it and I don't know who they talk with, and if there's been some conversations about what that means for them, for their workplace, and for individually. So yeah, if that, Carrie, if you want to talk more about that, I'd love to have that conversation. You know where to find me.
One of the comments I had earlier is, I know there's a lot of things I don't know. What I do know is that there are people with answers, and the key is to find them. So thanks that both of you are not only on today, but making yourself available. We have another question. Curious how we support remote work for groups or individuals not set up with effective technology to mimic their face-to-face environments, especially when used to very collaborative environments. So any tips, thoughts you can give with respect to that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is one, I think that's a really good point because we saw this really, really common when people were trying to set up entire workforces remotely too, is people didn't even have the basic connection software. So, people would spend hours trying to log in and figure out how to sign into their office environments. They didn't have the contact information for people. And so if you can't really expect people to be productive if they don't even have the most basic tools necessary to kind of communicate and get their work done. But I think that workspace and environment is a really interesting kind of perspective too, because again, some people have the capacity to set it up more like their work environment. Some people are really limited for space or time or what those arrangements are. So I think hopefully we see more kind of tech solutions to this as making more similarities to the regular workspace.
And maybe just briefly, Kylie, to add to that, there are lots of workplaces where the technology, just considering where people are, just won't work. So, those require the folks getting together and maybe talking to some other, as you have done, I know, not-for-profits, organizations about what they're doing in those situations, because there's lots of wisdom out there if we can find the right people to ask.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're hearing too a little bit, there are some, because there was a requirement to stop or shift, have made that shift, and now they have an option. Do we return or do we continue what tools do I have that I should be using to evaluate? And especially if you have a large workforce that theoretically could all be remote, but maybe some prefer. So there's a lot of reflection, I suspect, that you're seeing going on, because then there's some evaluation. Okay, and eventually we will have a vaccine. We will get through this. But the question is, okay, so what does that mean for the future, and how do I evaluate? Any guidance on that?
Yeah, I think we're going to see probably easily half of people don't want to return to the office full time, or want some sort of blended piece. I mean, I've talking to a company here, they're a major London-based insurance company, and they all worked remotely overnight, and it was no problem for them. But now people don't want to have to commute for an hour and a half to get back into an office in a crowded city where they could be living anywhere else and doing their job anywhere else. So I think the personality traits will be really useful in evaluating who's going to be most effective in a remote work environment, or who might be most effective being in it really regularly. But also making sure you have those options for people who are going to be more effective in a group, in person, who want to be in the office. So it's going to be a lot of performance management and evaluating what environments people are most effective in.
Yeah, and it's just my experience, primarily my background on the communication side. So just the communication challenges from a management perspective when you have that remote workforce. Mm-hmm. And while Zoom, it's interesting, just Zoom will work well 1, 2, 3, if you have enough time, but then it becomes a diminishing return when you get to 6 and beyond. There's some fascinating, probably research going on just on the communication with respect to this kind of mode. We have a question with self-care, and it's a comment of being hugely underrated consideration for remote work. I never thought my workspace environment would impact so significantly on the success of my work and routines.
Yeah,
go for it. One of the things I think, and I've talked a lot, and I have some fantabulous, I don't know what that word is, friends and colleagues. And you know what? It is really significant. Early on, about a month in to the COVID piece, I was having to rewrite things 2 or 3 times because there was so much chaos and uncertainty in our world. It was having a huge impact. I've worked from remotely since 2003, but this is not the same. So you're right, we really have to think about what we need and how to set up our spaces and our environments, and take the time now that we can get out and cycle and hike and run to do those kinds of things so we can better manage our stress.
Do you think it's going to affect, go ahead there, Ian. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, and especially reflect on what works well in the office, but what works really well in a home working environment, because hopefully there's some stuff about well-being that we can take forward and improve things in the future instead of just trying to get back to normal.
There's another comment. Perhaps one of the most difficult things right now is that our normal ways of reading employees, colleagues, and behaviors can be masked by the situation we're experiencing. So it can be tough to know how to best to respond. And that unto itself illustrates we almost need to slow down, I suppose, and take more time to be able to adjust and to read and to communicate. Or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that really gets to the point that Heather was talking about the really kind of the communication and listening is so important.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then we're getting to the bottom of the hour, so we'll wrap up. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to jump in.
Faye's got one in the chat.
Yes, there. Can you comment on the diversity of personalities leads to increased success for the business, and how specific personalities will be more successful working remotely, and how we can work to balance that? And it was actually one of the questions we had in advance a little bit too. Does this mean we change the way we look at personality traits when we recruit, given our work environment now is different? So
yeah,
on Faye's question, yeah.
I'm going to jump in, Faye. Maybe you and I should, this is a longer, that needs a longer answer. But, you know, when you're looking at recruiting and you know that you're going to, at least in the near future, have people working from home, you might want to ask, you might want to consider that. And it doesn't mean that whatever the personality trait that people can't learn and adapt and all those kinds of things, but there will be some people who are better at it than others. That's a big question. Happy to have the conversation offline.
But that's one of the original purposes of the research we did last year, is because we were thinking, if we're going to be recruiting more people to work remotely, then what are the traits that we need to look for in those workers? So yeah, it's a really good point.
So we obviously know, and as you noticed and acknowledged, every workplace is different, every sector is different, but with those that have the option for work from home, particularly the small businesses, that when they build their team, they talk about, this is a small team, so we have to do things to build that team, and sometimes it's just exercises to build and understand each other, because they may have a job description or may not. And by the way, your job description might be changing, particularly in this circumstances. Any guidance you would give to those that now have found themselves in a situation where part or all of their team is working remotely? Do you focus more on those team building? Do you look at those aspects to ensure that particularly with a small team, that you have that kind of team attitude and an environment where people support each other?
Yeah, I think building that is really important to focus on now as well, too. So I know some companies do virtual pub quizzes or something that are, you know, extracurricular activities that are open to everyone but not mandatory. And like in the regular workplace, some people really love those and some people may be a bit less interested. But doing those kind of activities are just as important now. And sometimes you can use the tech that there's kind of some interesting and fun ways of doing it. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't want to see those disappear, because you can't necessarily get that same level of interaction and connection with people if you never see them.
Yeah, I think one of the managers I was talking to with an organization, he's actually communicating more and also looking at ways to do online collaboration and team building more than even did when the workplace and environment and the team was there. So
yeah, which is great.
Yeah, just to wrap things up, I'll turn it back to you. I don't know if Ian or Heather, if you wish to start, just a couple of takeaways that you would give some advice to those, and then we'll do the book giveaway here.
Ian, I'll give you the proverbial last word.
Okay, yeah, I think it's just interesting to see how looking at any sort of potential, really defining what the success criteria are, what the performance management criteria are, you can say, okay, here are the traits where people are going to be effective in this. But not necessarily saying that those are the only people who are going to be effective, but also what support can we give people? Because I think a lot of companies are really, really realizing that now is if they want to maintain the high levels of performance that they might have had before, they need to make sure that they're supporting people in unexpected circumstances. You know, we're kind of all going through a similar thing right now, but we're going to see more divergence in the future, but people are still going to need supports in different ways.
Excellent. Heather, final thought, and then we'll do the book giveaway.
I'm comfortable. Let's move on to prize draw and all those things.
All right, so we've entered all the names, and thanks everybody for hanging in. That's my sound effects drum roll. So what books are we, Ian, are we giving away? The first one?
We're giving High Potential, How to Spot, Manage, and Develop Talented People at Work.
Excellent.
And we are giving away Myths of Work, Myths of Social Media.
Yeah.
Myths of Social Media, Dismiss the Misconceptions, and Do Something Effectively.
Oh, the first winner is, and I have to double check, they're still here, is Jody Patel is the winner of the first one. And
Fantastic.
And Faye Craven is still with us. Congratulations to Faye and congratulations to Jody. Your names were randomly drawn and you'll be getting a book. How are we getting the book to these folks?
Well, we'll figure that out. I know both of them, so I will follow up. And I don't know whether you can show the slide with the prize draws on, because I'm offering anyone who wants, who's participated in this call and would like a high potential trade indicator and a debrief. I'll give you 20% off if you go contact me through our brand new website, just up this morning, literally 7:15 this morning, at sagetransitions.com. I'm really excited about this and would like to talk with you. So if you want to see how you and others might use HPTI, I'll give you 20% off if you contact me by July 10.
That's awesome. Thanks, Heather. And a great offer to those that have hung in to the end. So a little bonus. That's great. A reminder, this has all been recorded. We'll make this available on our YouTube channel and we'll communicate as well. Ian, what time is it for you?
It's 6:30, so it's now the end of my day in the evening.
End of the day. So thanks
Yeah.
tuning in. This is the one opportunity that we, among others, that the technology does allow us to reach a far larger audience on a global scale. So I want to thank you for taking time in your evening, and Heather for joining us this morning and working with us and putting this together. Fascinating topic. We know that we are inundated by Zoom sessions and webinars, lots of choices. So thanks to all the attendees for joining us, and please spread the word of the work that Ian and Heather are doing. Some great information this morning, and I want to thank both of you for joining us.
Okay, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I'm just going to wrap things up by thanking those that have come on board to join us. We'll be communicating a little bit down the road as to when our next Business Smarts is. We'll likely have another Okanagan College School of Business session in July. We'll communicate that through our regular communication channels. So thanks for both of you for joining us. Thanks everyone for being a part of Business Smarts. Hope you all have a great day.